Hi guys, so we're obviously on to the last session of the week. Yesterday, hopefully you spent a little bit of time writing about a line that comes from the beginning of the novel, a line that establishes Scrooge as being a terrible representation of humanity, the worst of being a human. What I want to do today is basically repeat the same process, but for writing about something that happens in the middle. The way to get good at essay writing is through repetition, internalising the process, and then you can have a bit more flair with it once you've got that kind of structure nailed. So you can see here, I already wrote this paragraph yesterday for you as an example. I picked the simile as hard and sharp as flint and modelled the process of writing about that line. And I asked you to pick a different line from stave 1 to write a paragraph using the same structure as mine. So as I say, all I'm going to do is the same today, but I'm going to write about the middle of the novel. And I've already selected a line from the middle of the novel that I'm going to write about that starts to show Scrooge as a character who changes. So obviously I've already written in detail about the fact that at the beginning of the novel he is avaricious, cruel, all those sorts of things. Now in the middle he starts to change, and I've chosen some words from stave 3 when he has seen the Cratchit family and he's observed them, and he asks the ghost if Tiny Tim will live, and the ghost says no, basically that Tiny Tim won't live. And then he attacks Scrooge by repeating back his lines, decrease the surplus population. And it says, Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit and was overcome with penitence and grief. So regret and sadness, yeah? He feels completely ashamed of his behaviour. So this is a lovely line to show the beginning of Scrooge changing. So I started the last paragraph I wrote for you yesterday with the words at the beginning, because obviously they came from the beginning of the novel. So now I'm going to use the words in the middle, just to show that I'm shifting to later in the text. So in the middle, Dickens begins to present Scrooge as a character who changes. His experiences travelling with the spirits make him understand how misguided, should we go with, he has been. So I'm just trying to get a kind of intro sentence here to kind of make my essay nice and easily and flowy, so that when the reader's reading it, they don't suddenly jump to a new line. They've been signposted and nicely directed. So in the middle, Dickens begins to present Scrooge as a character who changes. His experiences travelling with the spirits make him understand how misguided he has been. So I'm just giving a kind of general sense of what happens to Scrooge as he changes. Obviously now I want to get my line in as quickly as possible, so I can't start any real analysis until I've got my line. So again, I can't just chuck the line in, I need to contextualise what happens. So I'm going to say, after seeing the Cratchits celebrate Christmas and discovering that Tiny Tim will die, Scrooge let's change that, will die. The spirit repeats the words, decrease the surplus population, back to Scrooge, and Dickens tells us that, actually I changed that, I don't like tells, I'm going to say describes how, because that sounds better. Describes how Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words. I'm just going to put an ellipsis there because I don't necessarily need that middle bit. So I'm going to say, I just cut to the end bit, overcome with penitence and grief. So I've got the words from the line that I want to write about, the main ones, but I've left out a few because the line's quite long. So I've got my line. Obviously, I now need to say something about the whole line and what I can infer. So this leads the reader to infer. Now, this is a lovely line to write about inference, isn't it? 'Cause it's really easy. We all know if someone hangs their head, they feel ashamed of themselves. It's a really common human signal of feeling ashamed, isn't it? Leads the reader to infer that Scrooge feels ashamed of himself for being so callous. Callous basically means that he's so uncaring about the lives of the poor. So he's started to change, hasn't he? Scrooge of Stave 1 wouldn't have felt shame. He didn't care. But now he feels ashamed of himself for being so callous about the lives of the poor. So now I can zoom in on a particular word to talk about more. So I think I'm going to pick the word grief. Penitence and grief. Now, grief does mean sadness, but it's about death. We often associate the word grief with death, don't we? We feel grief when someone dies or we lose something. So I think Scrooge not only feels regret, but he also feels a sense that he's lost so much, that he's mourning the loss of himself, in a sense. So I'm going to say, in particular, the word grief is interesting. It is, I think, an interesting choice of word. I think sadness would have been more logical, or shame, but grief, I think, is interesting. In particular, the word grief is interesting because we often associate it with death or mourning the loss of a loved one. It seems to indicate how deeply Scrooge has been moved by the vision of Tiny Tim. And he's mourning the loss of his future death, isn't he? And is, in a sense, mourning his future death. Yeah? So even though Tiny Tim's still alive, Scrooge's almost mourning him already because he feels that sense of loss so acutely. So then we just have to do our final sentence where we go big and we think thematically. And it seems, doesn't it, that Dickens is warning the audience that this level of greed and cold-heartedness has real implications for the poor, that people are dying because of this. They have the power to change that. So we don't need to talk about Scrooge, Tiny Tim at all. We need to talk about those big concepts and ideas. So it seems that Dickens is presenting an emotional warning to the reader that ignoring the suffering of the poor is causing the deaths of innocent children, deaths that they have the power to prevent through greater philanthropy, which means basically charity and kindness. So you can see how we've built our next paragraph in exactly the same as our first one. We needed to do a little bit of work at the beginning to signpost and move through the story. We couldn't just jump to our line. We needed to move through the story first and build our line in. But then once we've got it, it's the same process. So let's have a quick check. In the middle, Dickens begins to present Scrooge as a character who changes. His experiences travelling with the spirits make him understand how misguided he has been. After seeing the Cratchits celebrate Christmas and discovering that Tiny Tim will die, the spirit repeats the words to decrease the surplus population back to Scrooge. And Dickens describes how Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words, overcome with penitence and grief. Again, notice there how I've built the wires from the story into the sentence. I haven't said a quote to show this is. I've said Dickens describes how, and then I've naturally built the words in. That's not easy to do, but with practice you'll get good at it. This leads the reader to infer that Scrooge feels ashamed of himself for being so callous about the lives of the poor. In particular, the word grief is interesting because we often associate it with death or mourning the loss of a loved one. It seems to indicate how deeply Scrooge has been moved by the vision of Tiny Tim and is in a sense mourning his future death. It seems that Dickens is presenting an emotional warning to the reader that ignoring the suffering of the poor is causing the deaths of innocent children, deaths that they have the power to prevent through greater philanthropy. So I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe up here I'd like to add the words of the novel, because I felt that sounded weird. So in the middle of the, and I'm going to say novella, because that just means a short novel. But other than that, I'm pretty happy. I think I've built in my quotation well. I've talked about the whole quotation and what we can infer. I've said something about an individual word, and I've gone to the big message. So again, just another example of how the process works. So what I'd like you to do to finish this week is to try and write about something that happens at the end of the novel. So if we change that stem to at the end of the novella, and I'd just like you to pick a line from stave 5 that shows that Scrooge has changed. And if you remember, in a previous session, we already picked some out. So you don't have to think of any. We've already got some. You could pick out this one, I'm as merry as a schoolboy. You could pick no fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, staring cold, any of these words. And then look at, build, you can watch my example again and just using it to help build your own paragraph that explains how Scrooge changes by the end of the novella. Once you've had a go at that, please can you send the work that you've done to your teachers. So our email addresses are all on this screen for you. It's much better if you email it to us than send it through Show My Homework because we don't always get the notifications. Please feel free to either type up all the work you've done this week and send it that way, or take photographs of your English book if you prefer. But obviously it's great to receive work, it makes us feel happy, and it means we can give you personal feedback to help you with the next session. I hope you've had a great week, guys, and I'll speak to you again next week.